Really glad you're here today for a couple reasons. One, I love celebrating things like that. Again, it's your giving, and so I love celebrating it and just getting a chance to say, man, way to go. It's really cool stuff. Two, we're starting this new series today, and really simple title, just called Family Matters. And here's the deal of just Family Matters, okay? Super simple. One is all of us are part, in some way, shape, or form of family, right? And whether your family, wherever you're at in that season, maybe you're a grandparent, maybe you're a parent, maybe you're a student or a child, maybe you're parenting your parents, you got cousin dynamics and sometimes sibling dynamics and all of these things, right? And here's the reality, that regardless of where you are at in that season, your family matters. And your part in that family matters. Your part matters. Now, the other truth is this, that inside of all these things, there are some family matters. Right? There are some family issues. You got to talk about some things sometimes, right? You feel that with me? And whether you're in a family dynamic where you occasionally hit a pothole or whether you have had complete engine failure and it's dysfunctional and broken. And some of you're here today and you're kind of still in this like little nuclear family gig, and it's kind of good. You got some kids at home or whatever. Some of you are getting ready to launch kids out, and I'm there kind of right now, and so we're getting ready to start a group therapy group for that. But it's like we're just kind of in that seat, right? And some of you, you're just starting new. Some of you are single, and I love that for you. I think it's amazing treasure. I mean, that's awesome. Some of you are single again for reasons you wish you weren't, and maybe there was a breakdown in relationship. Some of you are widows or widowers, and you walk through this navigation of grief and yet understand this dynamic of family still, and you are living in it, and it's a way you didn't necessarily map it. And some of you are single parenting, and some of you are foster parenting, and some of you are engaged in things like safe families where you're occasionally like in this parenting influential world. There's all sorts of these dynamics at play, right? And when we're in it, it can feel like really great sometimes. It can be really great sometimes. And other times it can be full of all sorts of grief or just temporary crisis. It can, like, what do we do with? And the schedule's chaotic. And what are we doing with screen time in our family? And how do we play that and navigate that? And what traditions are we building and not building? And we can feel pulled in lots of different directions. And sometimes we find ourselves in these moments and they're not quite perfect, right? They're not quite ideal. And we can look around a little bit and we can say, like, who did this to us? Or who did this to me? And sometimes there's a conflict and it's obvious, right? And it's like, it's there. We didn't even talk about in-laws. Like, that's a whole different series, right? But I mean, it's because of that. It's that thing or whatever, right? And it's like, okay, like who caused that? How did we get here, right? And then sometimes in a moment of deep reflection, we'll stop just for a minute and we might look at the family tension and we might ask a question like this. Did I do that? Anybody remember that with me? Anybody? Then look, if you raise your hand like that, and you didn't laugh, you either have childhood trauma over this show or you need some church freedom. Play it again. We're going to play it again. You need church freedom. It's okay to laugh in church. Did I do that? Come on, somebody. Whoever just wanted to just urkel their pants and listen, did I? Okay, right? I mean, that was classic for me, right? Just childhood and Steve Urkel and everything else. And here's the thing, right? We didn't call the series. That's the only thing we'll do with Urkel for the last 3 weeks, okay? But I just couldn't let it pass, okay? We're here in it. Because here's the thing, right? Like, we sometimes wonder, did I do that? Like, what was my part in the equation? And so over the next few weeks, we're going to talk about some things, and we're going to try and be really practical along the way. But before we get too practical, I just want to be really honest with you. Before we get too practical, because there are some really practical things we have to talk about. We do have to talk about what do we do with grief inside a family? How do we navigate that? We really do have to talk about things like what do we do with mental health inside of our family? We do have to talk about what do we do with this pesky thing called screen time? What do we do with disagreement? What do we do with conflict? How do we handle conflict? What do we do with changing seasons? Like when it really is shifting before us and we are at one time excited and one time grieving. What do we do with singleness and how do we navigate that? And how do we navigate that in a world that weirdly puts pressure on us to get married, even if we're okay being single? Like how do we navigate those kind of dynamics? And we'll drop some of those in through the next couple of weeks, and then also on Sundays, and then also during the week, we'll share some things and talk about some things in some other ways. But before we do real practical, here we've got to talk about some of the core element, because here's the reality. You know what I know when it comes to any human relationship, especially in the context of family, whether it's nuclear family, extended family, whatever it is, you know what I know. And that is we can solve a problem, and we could give each other some tools and help each other in it, and we could solve a problem. And as soon as that problem is done, there's another one in line behind it. Right? I mean, there just is. And they might vary in shape and size and scope, but there's another problem coming, right? And so what we want to do is say, look, what are the key elements? What's at the core, so that regardless of what problem comes, regardless of the size and scope, I actually have a beginning framework with which to approach that problem. Okay? Now, here's what's funny. We think about that a lot in the context of jobs or companies or things that we run strategies for, but we often miss it in this context of a dynamic with family and how God might design and shape a family, and how God, just a couple core elements, might put us in a better position to respond to the ongoing wave of matters that arise, right? So today we'll dive in and talk about it from that perspective a little bit. If you've got a Bible or you want to get a phone, I really want to invite you to turn to a passage that maybe it's in a document in the Bible that maybe you haven't been to a lot, even if you've been in church for a really long time. It's called Deuteronomy. It's the 5th book in the Old Testament of your Bible. It's compiled by a guy named Moses, and Deuteronomy is kind of a weird name, right? You probably haven't used that this week in any time. And really, it's about a second telling, and it's really about a second telling of what they would have called the law or this covenant relationship with God. It's God like repeating, hey, this is how the relationship works. This is how our relationship is going to function best. I've designed you to flourish, and I've designed you to flourish in relationship with me. And in order to do that, he's like repeating from a slightly different angle, here's how this covenant relationship works. Here are kind of some laws. Here are the guidelines. Here are the guardrails. This is how the relationship works best. Every relationship that works has either spoken or unspoken laws or guardrails. Okay? Every relationship that actually works has those. And this is God's dynamic with the nation of Israel, his broader family, okay? And in the early stage of this, we're going to listen to a guy named Moses, who, inspired by the Spirit, is talking to the nation of Israel in one moment here. And what's interesting is that Moses is in a time of transition. Moses at this time is at the ripe young age of 120, okay? Dude has seen some life, okay? And it's kind of broken, like he's messed up on some things. He actually was a murderer. He was trying to live into his calling to rescue people, and he got out in front of himself, wasn't about being murdered somebody, like trying to do that. He kind of leaves for a while, gets kicked out of where he's at for a while. God redeems him, restores him over the course of many years, sends him back to lead the nation of Israel out of slavery in Egypt, which they had been in for hundreds of years. And so Moses has done that. He's led them through this wandering journey in the desert. He's brought them to the point where they're going to cross the Jordan River, and they're going to cross into this, what's called the Promised Land. It's this land of Canaan that God has set out for them. And at 120 years old, Moses knows his time is coming. He's not going to get into the Promised Land. And here's what's happening is Moses actually is in leadership succession. He's like handing off the baton here, okay? And really, inside of a family or inside of any kind of leadership, there's a few things Moses does that are just fantastic. He says, hey, let me reflect a little bit and celebrate on something. And then just from my position as the person who's been the leader and the influencer here, let me just give you a little bit of counsel. Okay, let me reflect and let's celebrate. Let me give you a little bit of counsel. And then let me give you a warning. Candidly, he gives a warning. And honestly, it's a warning that only somebody from his seat could have given with all the life that he's seen and the reflective learning he's done on it. Deuteronomy chapter 6 is where we're going to find this conversation, this little, really kind of in this moment, monologue, God through Moses to the nation of Israel. And it's going to help us. We're going to kind of spring out of this in different directions over the next few weeks. But again, most of us probably haven't spent a lot of just, deep devotional quiet time on, during the mornings at 6 a.m. memorizing the book of Deuteronomy. But there really is a lot of gold in here about how we live life with God. And this is one of those equations. So here's Moses. You got to imagine Joshua, the young leader, who really is another phenomenal story of courage and boldness and things that look like risk but are actually just full of faith. You got to imagine Joshua is really close by because Moses has been mentoring him a little bit. He's probably standing really close by. There's all of these people, and you got to literally think all of these people with all of these generations, right? It's a bunch of people in the wilderness. It's thousands and thousands of Hebrew people, all sorts of generations, right? Maybe they're just all there. And they just want to get to the promised land. And before they go, God's like, okay, but let me help you with some things so that we live well together inside this relationship when you get in. So Deuteronomy chapter 6, this is what, again, Moses, inspired by the Spirit of God, says. These are the commands, the decrees, and the laws. So we talked about this a few weeks ago in February. These are the ordinances. These are the decrees. This is what's going to be ordinary for all of people in God's family. I'm just going to tell you, this is ordinary living for all of God's children. He's just playing, again, you have those things in your family and in your workplace and your community groups. You've got those things. He says, these are just the commands, the decrees, and the laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you're crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord, have this great awe-inspired relationship with the Lord your God as long as you live, by keeping all of his decrees, by doing what's ordinary for people who follow God, and the commands I give you, and so that you may enjoy long life. Well, that's kind of a cool little promise tossed in there. Right? Everybody's looking for the fountain of youth, and what kind of powdered greens do I have to drink to live a little longer? Well, Moses is just like, hey, look, here's some. I got spiritual powdered green. How do we do this thing? Okay? So you may enjoy long life. Verse 3, hear Israel and be careful. It's going to take some attentiveness. Be careful to obey that so that it may go well with you, and that you may actually increase greatly in the land flowing with milk and honey, just a land of plenty, just as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you, again, hundreds of years ago, multiple generations ago. Verse 4, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. That word for strength there that Moses uses is kind of a word with an everything you got. So, yeah, your physical strength, but your intellectual strength, your fortitude, your inner fortitude, your resource strength, your money strength, your talent, giftedness, abilities, strength, your relational strength, all the strength that you have, whether you think it's great or little, just love God with all of that. Be devoted to God with all of that. These commandments that I give you today are beyond your hearts, and press them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your forehead. Write them on the door frames of your houses and your gates. And some of you may be a little more familiar with that one. You might, oh yeah, I've heard that, read that, memorized that. That's great. It's so helpful. We'll dive into that a little bit next week and try and make it as practical as possible for us today, thousands of years later. Now, here's where things start to change. Verse 10, now we're getting into the warning. We've heard that, hey, God rescued you. God pulled you out. He's wanting it to go well with you. We've heard some wisdom and some counsel, talk about, impress these things. Love the Lord your God. Now here comes the warning. When the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you a land with large, flourishing cities. Now check this out. That you did not build, houses filled with all kinds of good things that you did not provide, wells, opportunities, so then that's literal wells of water for them, but opportunities, pathways, resources, right, that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. Then when you eat, when you start benefiting from all this, when you start enjoying all of it, when you eat and you are satisfied, here it is again, be careful. Be careful. Man, when you take in all this goodness, please be careful. Because goodness is good until it's destructive. And goodness is good until it's destructive. Be really careful, Moses says. And he's seen it, right? He's seen the people not do well with good before. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord. who brought you out of Egypt, who rescued you from the land of slavery. If you're here today and you're a follower of Jesus, you could say it this way, be careful not to forget the Lord who actually is the one who rescued you, who saved you, who forgave you, who restored you, who gave you a plan and a purpose, who gave you a hope of an eternity, and who is letting you experience his kingdom on this earth right now. Please be careful not to forget that. And you might say, look, but John, you don't know my life. Like, I have built everything I have. I came from nothing. I have built it all. And I would just say to you, you know what? You've built a lot. But you've added on to a lot. You happen to live in a place where there is a lot provided for us. Can we just be okay acknowledging that in our part of the world, there's a lot provided for us? There's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of pathway. There's a lot of open terrain in front of us, right? No matter how bad you think it's getting right now, there's been a lot of opportunity. Right? Most of us have built something that somebody else has started building. Most of us are in career pathways. Most of us are living in things that somebody else at least helped pave a way and plant a model. Right? I mean, can we just agree on that? Thank you. The rest of you should just say yes anyway, because on this point, I'm right. Okay, but you can think about everything else later, but on this one, I'm right. Okay, we're building on something else, right? And that's okay. That's okay. That's great. It's actually wise sometimes. All right, there's some wisdom in it. But what Moses is saying, and what God would say to us today, like he's talking to families, you hear here, like impress them on your children. I want you to teach these things. Help people who come behind you. Like just think about multiple generations, knowing the God you know, knowing the stories of the God you know, knowing his rescue like you know it, right? Not knowing your religion, but knowing your vibrancy of relationships. So he's like, please be careful. Now I want to start with the warning. Why, okay, at the end of the day, really, why the warning? And what would the warning mean to us? So here's this group of people. They're entering the land. Again, they've got this relationship with God, right? They've got this dynamic of God's been providing for them in the wilderness. He's been leading to them. There's this promised thing. And God's like, okay, but when it comes to this huge dynamic of your family matters. And along the way, you will experience family matters, even people in the Bible. I mean, just tons and tons and tons of family dysfunction stories all throughout the Bible, so we can all identify with that. Let's just be careful, because here's what's happening. Let's go to the flip chart here for a second. I want to show you this. Let's just imagine for a minute, if we could, that this to kind of envision this as the core of your life. Man, that for me, that's a really good circle, by the way. But just imagine that this is the core of your life. Okay, and so you just put yourself in with the people of Israel, and you'd say, man, okay, well look, the core of their life, like this is huge. Like, remember the God who rescued you. Be careful, right? So God is this component of their core. It's huge. Right? They're going in with the advantage of recent encounters and surrenders to the Lord. This is a good thing. But the warning is this. And listen, I want to paint this out for us because most of us, or lots of us, we need this warning. Because much like they were going into a land of plenty, we live in a land of plenty. Again, plenty of opportunities, plenty of things vying for our attention, plenty of things wanting to fill our schedule, plenty of good causes to embrace, plenty of social dynamics to try and entertain and sort out, right? Plenty of things to maintain, plenty of houses to keep up, plenty of yards to try, right? I mean, all of these things. And you say, be careful, because if you don't, quickly what happens is this God who is in the core of your life becomes just really a slice of that core. And we don't initially design it that way, but again, there's a lot of other things vying for the attention. So let's just have some moments of honesty. What are some of the other things that kind of creep into this world? Well, we're talking about family, like let's just acknowledge it. There is a reality that kids become part of the core. Like if we're not careful, kids become part of the core and they start sharing space with God. Right, it creeps in there a little bit. We can talk about all sorts of opportunity, but let's just talk about some things. Let's talk about there's this school dynamic, and that almost can feel regardless of age, right? There's a pressure to say, okay, how do I follow school? Like, how do I navigate that? As a parent, there's this pressure to say, what are my expectations of my kids? Which ones are fair and which ones aren't? And it feels like we're going to need something, right? And so we've got this dynamic of work, right? Whether we work right out of high school, whether we're working in high school, whether we're working 50 years later, there's this pressure to say, man, my job can require a lot of me. And when it doesn't require even a lot of my time, it can require a lot of my mental space, a lot of my emotional space. Like all of a sudden, because there's lots of opportunity, and because there's lots of need that it feels like the work opportunity has to provide for, all of a sudden it's in this prime place. And so it just becomes part of this deal. There's all sorts of these things. There's sports and the arts. Like, right, that's vying for time. What do I have to sign up for? What should we be in? What should we not be in? Like, okay, now we've got this one, and we keep additioning it, right? You can just go beyond that, like experiences. What are our family experiences? Where do we want our family to go? What do we wish our family would see? What trips do we want our family to have, right? Again, why? Because for many of us, there's lots of opportunity. We live in a land of plenty. Okay, then we're trying to like even figure out things like, okay, how again, I joked about like powdered greens, but whatever it is, right? Like, how do we navigate that? And we want to steward it well, and as we should, and it can become this thing that, okay, like now my life is kind of directed by what I'm trying to do health-wise and what I'm trying to figure out there. We've got some traditions we got to manage. We joked last week about grandma's ham, right? But that's like, maybe for some of us, that's the Easter tradition, like, right? I've honestly had this conversation with families. I'm almost embarrassed to say it, but I've actually had this conversation with families that the more important tradition on Easter is what we do with the basket and how we navigate family lunch. It's such an important deal that it actually crowds out the celebration of the resurrection and any awareness of trying to share that with people who don't yet know the Jesus you say you're celebrating. And we're there accidentally. Because we didn't always know we were supposed to be careful. Right? Because it's the land of plenty. And all of a sudden, this tradition is actually compelling how we move in some of this thing, right? We want to establish some security. Right? We've got to navigate that dynamic, and what's the security look like, and how do I plan for retirement? How do I plan for my kids, and what does this look like? What am I actually going to bring them, right? Then there is this retirement thing, and that's the other side of the work dynamic, and how do we play out the retirement piece, right? And what do we do with all of that? And now, we haven't even gotten here yet, and then there's this dynamic of friends, which most of us wish we had more, right? It's like, wait, what am I doing? And here's the thing. Listen, here's the thing. All of this crowds in and starts beckoning to not just be part of our life, but to help direct our life. When things get to the core, they're no longer asking to be a part. They are leveraging direction. Because listen, out of the core, we make decisions. Out of the core, we make decisions about what we do, about how we feel, about how we respond, about expectations. It's out of the core. So look at, just for a second, like play this out with me. Do you ever feel like you're pulled in a million directions? Thank you. Honest people in the room. We are going to learn to be honest, whether it's the lesson we do. Okay, but yeah, right? We're just pulled in a million directions, okay? Can I just say this to us? Like you and me together, all of us together, okay? Part of the reality is that oftentimes we find ourselves with a chaotic calendar because before that, we had a very crowded core. When the core is too crowded, the calendar will always be chaotic. Because all of these things are trying to influence. Wait, I got to have this other experience. Well, I was supposed to have this other experience, but I think Jesus wanted me to do this. Yeah, but what about this job that I still have in this part-time thing, and I've got to make sure I get that? And what about these kids or these grandkids that I'm trying to influence that I've got to do? Right? And all of them are in the core, so they all feel like they have this equal footing. Now, none of us would ever say, oh, yeah, they have all equal footing with God. We would never say that. But listen, this is why Moses is like, please be careful, because it's more subtle than it is overt. It's more tricky than it is out and out rebellion. And for most of us, can we just, again, another moment of honesty, which feels uncomfortable for lots of you for some reason today. But look, another moment, most of us are going to have to revisit this hundreds of times in our life. Hundreds of times. Why? Because when you settle it, you don't suddenly then live in a land that doesn't have plenty. You still live in the same environment and in the same spaces with the same dynamics. And so you keep coming back to this thing of, wait, okay. Okay, so here's the question, right? Just with calendar as an example, right? Part of the reason that we often have a calendar is because we have a very crowded core. And what Moses is saying is be careful. Be careful. Man, there's so much good around. There's so much good. But good isn't good anymore when it is subtly placed on equal footing with God. That's not good anymore. Then it's a God. It's not a gift anymore. When a gift becomes a God, it's a curse. There's a priority thing here. And look, part of the reason that we feel stretched, part of the reason that we don't know how to navigate our problems is because we got a crowded core. We have too many filters we're trying to run it through before we solve it. So what's the answer? Well, let's go back a little bit in the passage. I want to take you back starting in verse 4. And this is it's a very small part of what is called the Shema, that's actually a part of what the people of Israel, there's this passage, there's a couple other passages that come together and form the Shema. It's part of what the people of Israel would have repeated at least twice a day, morning and evening. And lots of them would have repeated it 3 times. They would have said it again when they went to bed. As a way of trying to form an anchor in their soul, just trying to form this anchoring point of, okay, when I get up, this is what I live by. Later in the evening, I want to just ensure this is what I live by. When I go to bed at night, I want to ensure this is what I lived by. Okay, there's this constant repetition of this. And here's what it says. Hear, O Israel. And that word hear, that word hear, it has very little to do with sound waves penetrating the ear. It's more a picture of absorption. It's more of a picture of let something be dumped over your head and soaked into your life than it is what gets into your ear. It's like, hear this, absorb this, all of Israel. The Lord your God, the Lord is one. He's it. There's nobody like him. He's the God. The Lord your God, the Lord is one. So, love him with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. So love him. Follow him. Obey him. Listen to him. Heed him. Default to him. Trust him. With all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. Here's the thing. Maybe in part because it got repeated so long, and maybe in part because of the way we look at the Bible today, that sounds a little bit like a theological statement, right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. It sounds like a theological statement, doesn't it? Just a little bit. It honestly isn't. I mean, you can make it one, you can say it is, we could study God out of it, but it's really not. Far more than a theological statement. It's actually a statement of allegiance. It's a statement of allegiance. Like, don't just say, love the Lord your God. Don't live that. The Lord your God, the Lord is one. He's the king. He's the ultimate. He's the king. He's the source. All the things you built, even if you started from nothing, he's the source of that. He's the one who gave you the ingenuity, the creativity, the physical strength, the physical know-how, the brain power. Like, that's all. Like, he's the king. He's the king. It's not a theological statement. It's a statement of allegiance. It's a statement of, okay, I raise my hand to the king. I obey the king. I follow the king. I trust the king. The king is the source of how we're going to live this thing out. The king sets the values. The king sets the pace. The king says, right, I actually do all of this for the king. The king gives me lots of good things that I get to use for him. I serve the king. I serve the king. It's a statement of allegiance. Remember this thing. Let's go back. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. When this is it, when this is the core, we're not loving the Lord our God with all of our heart, with all of our soul, with all of our strength. We're loving God with a portion of our heart, soul, and strength because we're loving our friends. And look, you're like, wait, we're supposed to hate our friend? No. Listen. Here's all Moses is saying. Here's all God is asking. As a help to us, what he's saying is, hey, look, inside this thing of the core, really let the core be filled with God. Let the core be filled with God. Let God consume all of the core. Let him be first. Let him be only. Let him be primary. Let him be leader. Let him be strongest voice. Let him be clear director. Let him be most submitted to. Let him have the greatest allegiance. So that every other thing that comes runs first through one filter. So that we are first not pulled in a million directions. We're invited to one. We're invited to one. We're invited to one. So that it's out of this core that we weigh, okay, what is my schedule going to look like? How am I going to raise my kids? How are we going to navigate that? It's out of this that we say, how will I navigate grief? It's out of this we say, what will my friendships look like? What will my friendships with Jesus followers look like? What will my friendships with not Jesus followers look like? What are my relationships of influence? How will I approach my work? How will I approach work and money and income? How will I approach sports and arts and all that goes with that? How will I approach the calendar? How will we approach broken relationships? How will we, right? All of it comes from here, because remember, the core is influencing how we respond to those things. So when it's about what are we going to do, can I just say, like on the calendar thing, if we could come back to this, or if we could go to this, I'm just telling you, you will get some freedom and some permission when you are trying to navigate 99 things that you think you have to do in the fall, and you know you have capacity for about 9. Do you feel that in like the life cycle rhythms? Okay. It's like, what in the world am I supposed to do with that? Let it run through this filter. Hey, God, here are all the things. You want to help me, God? You better want to help me, because I'm in over my head. You want to help me? Look, here's the thing. Look, because then we let God influence. Like, how are we going to parent? How are we going to respond? How are we going to grandparent? How do we respond? How are we going to parent our prodigal? How are we going to influence as a grandparent when we don't necessarily see everything the same way as their parent? How are we going to navigate this sibling dynamic? I can't tell you how much my heart breaks about how many stories I have to listen to of siblings who have had great relationships and lose all of it over ridiculous disputes of inheritance. And do you know why? It's because there's too much in the core. The core is crowded. When all of this other stuff stays outside, right? Money and inheritance and even family dynamics. Look, it's going to be risky in West Michigan. Come on, somebody. Even your family tradition needs to be outside this circle, friends. Right? Some of you, I mean, you're enslaved to a mess, and it's got beauty and it's got good, but just put it back in its rightful place. Don't chuck it. Don't go home and say, my pastor told me we should never talk again. Okay, right? It's not that, right? I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying get things in its rightful place. Put it back in its rightful place. Put it back. Just put it back. Look, even the whole dynamic, again, this is a lot us in current culture, even the entire dynamic of family needs to be outside this circle so that God can influence it. Too many of us, we're making decisions about our family before we even consider what God's thinking. In fact, we're forming theology about God based on our family priority. Man, that's risky, friends. Do you hear the be careful? Be careful. Man, so here's the dynamic. Like, let the core be occupied. Let the core be occupied. Like, love the Lord your God. And that's this decision, right? And again, most of us are going to have to make it hundreds of times. I've made it. We've made it hundreds of times. Like, I had to do a real heart check this morning. I got up even a little earlier than I typically do on a Sunday. So I'm like, God, if you want me to preach this, we better just run this through my grid one more time. Like, where am I at, okay? Hundreds of times. And that's not bad. That's good. It means you got a really gracious God who keeps inviting it back, right? Let the soul be occupied by one big God, not crowded by a bunch of little things that are supposed to be gifts, fun, great, cherished, memory-making. They're beautiful and they're wonderful. Man, I love it. When it's out here and God gets to be the first influence. So here's the thing. You remember last week, if you were here when we celebrated the resurrection last week, we told this story about these ladies who first went to the tomb and they found that Jesus wasn't there anymore. And they didn't know what to do with that, right? And they're like, what? And they go walking down the street and Jesus appears before them, which still is like this mind-blowing moment. Right? Like, what are you doing with that, right? And you remember what they did? They just dropped to their knees in worship. I mean, they didn't have any other response. They just dropped to their knees in worship. And we don't live in this kind of culture, and so I understand it. So sometimes it's hard for us to come back to it. But in a culture like that, where it's Jesus and he's clearly the king, that's what you do. You bow. You bow. Who's really going to be on the throne? And friends, I'm just telling you, there are not 19 thrones. There's just one. It's just one seat. It's like, okay, so, and they just bow. There's this just place and this posture and this decision to say, yeah, Jesus, you're the king. You're the king. And so regardless of where you're at in the family rhythm, single again, young adult, grandparent, great-grandparent, sibling with good relationships or sibling with some fractures, cousin, wherever you're at in the family dynamic, let's just ask one question. Just one question. In a world that's asking us to bow to many things, will we bow to one king? In a world that's asking us to bow to many things, will we bow to one king? Because here's the deal. Listen, here's the deal. We're all already bowed. We may not acknowledge it. We may not like it because we like our strength and our independence and things. But we're already bowed to something. Even if it's to ourselves and our own pleasures and preferences, we're all bowed to something. We're all surrendered to somebody's cause, somebody's perspective. And Moses is like, please be careful. Please be careful. Because there's so much good. And it's got some stickiness to it when you get into this land. It's like, please be careful. And we live in a world, right? We live in a day. We live in a time period, right? Where all sorts of things are like, hey, bow to me and bow to me. Wait, no, bow to me, right? And none of them say that. It just comes with an invitation of, hey, wouldn't this be so much fun for you? And it can be. It can be. In its rightful place. But what if we could make a decision just bow to like one true king? Start there. And if we got to do it hundreds of times, who cares? I don't think Jesus is counting. I think he's just asking, with all I've done for you and the intensity with which I love you, could I just have your allegiance? Man, we could do some stuff together. Man, we could do some stuff